To understand that, like, the being on the set with her was, the idea was it should feel like one of her dinner parties.
For decades, Meg Ryan was known as Hollywood's sweetheart, the woman whose smile defined an era of romantic films and whose on-screen chemistry felt effortless. From charming love stories to box office hits, she built a career on warmth, vulnerability, and likability. But behind the scenes, the reality was far more complicated than fans ever imagined. Throughout her career, Meg worked alongside some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Most collaborations were praised publicly, wrapped in polite interviews and carefully chosen words. Yet insiders always suspected that not every partnership was as perfect as it appeared. There were moments of visible tension, awkward press appearances, and subtle distance that fans picked up on, even if no one ever spoke about it directly. For years, Meg Ryan chose silence. She avoided public conflict, never fed rumors, and rarely addressed speculation about difficult working relationships. That restraint only fueled curiosity. Was it professionalism, or was there something she wasn't ready to reveal? Now, at 64, Meg Ryan has finally broken that silence. In a rare moment of honesty, she is named the one co-star she struggled with the most, and the reason has nothing to do with jealousy or competition. Instead, it reveals a clash of personalities, power dynamics on set, and an experience that quietly changed how she viewed Hollywood. This isn't a story of drama for attention. It's a story about boundaries, respect, and the cost of staying silent for too long. And once you understand what really happened behind the camera, you'll see Meg Ryan and her career in an entirely different light. For much of her career, Meg Ryan was carefully positioned as the embodiment of approachability in Hollywood. She wasn't marketed as intimidating or untouchable, but as someone audiences felt they already knew. That image, while powerful, came with an unspoken expectation. Meg was supposed to be easy to work with, agreeable, and endlessly accommodating. According to those close to her, this pressure shaped how she navigated sets, interviews, and professional relationships, often at her own expense. Early in her rise to fame, Meg learned quickly that Hollywood rewarded silence more than honesty. If a project succeeded, harmony was assumed. If tensions existed, they were to be buried beneath smiles and promotional sound bites. Meg played along, believing professionalism meant endurance. She focused on the work, avoided confrontation, and trusted that respect would naturally follow. But that assumption would be tested as her career progressed and her status grew. As Meg transitioned from rising actress to box office draw, the dynamics on set began to shift. Power imbalances became more visible, especially when working alongside established male stars who were accustomed to control. Meg's warmth was often mistaken for passivity, and her collaborative nature interpreted as flexibility without limits. According to later reflections, this misunderstanding created environments where her voice carried less weight than it deserved. One particular collaboration stood out, not because of explosive arguments or public feuds, but because of sustained discomfort. Meg has since described feeling dismissed, talked over, and subtly undermined during the production. Creative input was not welcomed, boundaries were blurred, and respect was inconsistently applied. While nothing overt occurred, the accumulation of small moments left a lasting impact. At the time, Meg chose not to speak up. She feared being labeled difficult, a reputation that could quietly derail opportunities. Instead, she internalized the experience, convincing herself it was part of the industry's unspoken rules. Her silence was not agreement, it was survival. Like many actors of her era, especially women, she believed endurance was the price of longevity. Publicly, everything appeared seamless. The film was promoted successfully, interviews remained cordial, and the narrative of on-screen chemistry was preserved. Fans saw smiles and laughter, unaware of the strain beneath the surface. For Meg, this dual reality was exhausting. Playing a role didn't stop when the cameras did. It followed her into press tours and professional interactions. Over time, these experiences began to change how Meg viewed Hollywood. She became more selective, more guarded, and less willing to compromise her sense of self for approval. The industry that once felt exciting now felt transactional. According to those close to her, this shift wasn't about bitterness, it was about clarity. She began to recognize patterns that she could no longer ignore. Years later, Reflecting on that difficult collaboration, Meg realized it represented more than a single co-star. It symbolized a system where imbalance thrived quietly, protected by tradition and fear of consequence. Naming the experience wasn't about reopening old wounds. It was about acknowledging truth. At 64, when Meg finally chose to speak honestly about the co-star she struggled with most, it wasn't driven by resentment. It was driven by reflection. Time had given her perspective, and distance had given her courage. She no longer felt the need to protect an illusion that cost her peace. This first acknowledgement marked a turning point, not just in how audiences see Meg Ryan, but in how she sees herself. And as the story continues, it becomes clear that naming the co-star was only the beginning of a much deeper reckoning with fame, power, and self-respect. As Meg Ryan's career reached its peak, the gap between her public image and private reality grew wider. Audiences saw effortless charm and romantic chemistry. But behind the scenes, Meg was navigating an industry that often confused kindness with compliance. According to later reflections, this misunderstanding played a major role in the strained relationship she would eventually describe as her most difficult. The co-star Meg later named was someone widely respected and protected within the industry at the time. That status shaped the power dynamic on set in subtle but undeniable ways. Decisions were rarely questioned, behavior was excused as creative temperament, and any discomfort felt by others was expected to be absorbed quietly. Meg has explained that the issue was never about talent, it was about atmosphere. Working alongside someone who dominated the space left little room for collaboration. Meg entered the project believing in mutual respect. She valued listening, preparation, and emotional authenticity. But over time, she felt her contributions were minimized. Suggestions were brushed aside, scenes were reshaped without discussion, and moments meant to feel balanced began tilting in one direction. None of it crossed an obvious line, which made it harder to address. The absence of outright misconduct created plausible deniability, a common trap in professional environments. One of the most difficult aspects, Meg later revealed, was the isolation. Speaking up felt risky. Crew members noticed the tension but remained neutral, unwilling to challenge an established hierarchy. Meg was left to manage the discomfort alone, questioning whether she was overreacting or simply too sensitive. That self-doubt lingered long after the project ended. Public perception added another layer of pressure. The film was positioned as a success, and the chemistry between leads was praised. Meg was expected to reinforce that narrative, smiling through interviews and echoing enthusiasm she didn't fully feel. Each appearance became an extension of the performance, one that required emotional restraint rather than expression. This experience had a lasting effect on how Meg approached future roles. She became more cautious, more analytical, and far more protective of her boundaries. While some interpreted her selectiveness as career retreat, those close to her saw it as self-preservation. She was learning that longevity in Hollywood required not just talent, but discernment. Years later, when asked why she had remained silent for so long, Meg explained that timing mattered. Speaking earlier could have overshadowed her work or shifted focus away from the larger issue. She didn't want her career to be defined by conflict. Instead, she allowed time to provide distance, trusting that clarity would come when it was safe to reflect honestly. At 64, naming the co-star was not about assigning blame. Meg made it clear that she wasn't seeking apology or validation. Her goal was to describe an experience that shaped her understanding of power and respect. By doing so, she hoped to give context to choices she made later, stepping back, prioritizing personal life, and redefining success on her own terms. What makes her revelation resonate is its restraint. There was no dramatization, no sensational detail. Just a calm acknowledgement that not all collaborations are healthy, even when they appear successful from the outside. Meg's honesty challenges the myth that professionalism requires silence. Her story reveals a woman learning to trust her instincts, even when they contradict public expectation. And, as the narrative continues, it becomes clear that naming the co-star was less about the past and more about reclaiming her voice. With time and distance, Meg Ryan began to fully understand how deeply that difficult collaboration had shaped her relationship with Hollywood. What once felt like a single, uncomfortable experience gradually revealed itself as part of a larger pattern, one where power, reputation, and silence often outweighed honesty. According to Meg, recognizing this pattern was both unsettling and liberating. After the project ended, she noticed a shift in herself. She was still capable, still professional, but no longer willing to ignore discomfort for the sake of image. The industry, however, wasn't built to accommodate that kind of change easily. Offers became more complicated. Scripts arrived with expectations attached, not just about performance but about personality. Meg sensed that the version of her Hollywood preferred was the one that stayed. Agreeable. This internal conflict coincided with increased scrutiny of her personal life. Media narratives began to blur professional identity with private choices, placing Meg under a microscope she never asked for. The same warmth that once defined her brand was now dissected, questioned, and sometimes weaponized. She found herself being judged not just for her work, but for how well she conformed to an image others had created. The experience with that co-star had taught her an important lesson. Silence doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it simply delays understanding. While she still chose not to speak publicly, she began asserting herself in quieter ways, turning down roles that felt misaligned, stepping back from environments that felt restrictive, and prioritizing personal integrity over momentum. This period marked a reevaluation of success. For Meg, success was no longer about visibility or validation. It became about agency, the ability to choose where, how, and with whom she worked. She accepted that this shift might look like retreat to the outside world, but internally it felt like progress. She was reclaiming control in an industry that often confuses access with ownership. Relationships within Hollywood changed as well. Meg became more selective about collaborations, drawn to projects that offered mutual respect and creative balance. While this narrowed her opportunities, it deepened her satisfaction. She no longer felt compelled to prove herself through constant presence. Instead, she valued alignment over exposure. Looking back, Meg has acknowledged that the difficult co-star wasn't an anomaly. He was a reflection of a system that normalized imbalance. Naming him years later wasn't about reopening conflict. It was about acknowledging a truth that had long gone unspoken. By finally giving voice to that experience, she was also validating her younger self, who endured discomfort without language or support. At 64, Meg's perspective is grounded in self-awareness rather than regret. She doesn't frame her career in terms of loss, but evolution. The romantic comedies, the cultural impact, the public affection, those moments remain meaningful. But they no longer define her worth. What resonates most about her story is its restraint. There's no bitterness, no desire for confrontation. Just a calm, clear recognition that not all success is healthy, and not all silence is noble. Meg Ryan's honesty invites a broader conversation about respect, power, and the unseen costs of fame. As the story moves toward its conclusion, one thing becomes clear. Naming the co-star was never about him alone. It was about reclaiming narrative and reminding others that even the most beloved faces in Hollywood have boundaries that deserve respect. By the time Meg Ryan chose to finally name the co-star she struggled with most, she was no longer seeking resolution from Hollywood. She had already found it within herself. At 64, her decision to speak wasn't driven by anger or a desire to rewrite history. It came from clarity. Time had softened the edges of the experience, allowing her to reflect without emotion clouding truth. What remained was a simple realization. Her story deserved honesty. Meg has made it clear that naming this co-star was never about public confrontation. It was about context. For years, audiences speculated about her sudden retreat from the spotlight, the shift in her career choices, and the quiet way she stepped back from the industry that once embraced her. By sharing this experience, she offered an explanation, not an excuse for those decisions. It was her way of connecting the dots between past and present. Her revelation also reframed how her career is now viewed. Instead of a narrative of decline or disappearance, Meg's story becomes one of intentional distance. She chose peace over presence, boundaries over approval. That choice, while misunderstood at the time, now feels deeply resonant in an industry increasingly reckoning with power dynamics and workplace respect. What stands out most is the absence of bitterness in her words. Meg speaks with empathy, acknowledging that environments are shaped by systems as much as individuals. She doesn't deny the co-star's talent or achievements. Instead, she focuses on how the imbalance of power affected her experience, and how staying silent was once seen as the only viable option. In hindsight, Meg believes the experience sharpened her understanding of self-worth. It taught her that professionalism doesn't require endurance of discomfort, and that collaboration should be grounded in mutual respect. These lessons influenced not only her career choices, but her personal growth. They helped her redefine success on her own terms. Today, Meg Ryan is viewed with renewed appreciation. Audiences see her not just as the romantic lead of a bygone era, but as a woman who navigated fame with resilience and grace. Her honesty adds depth to a public image once defined solely by charm. It reminds us that strength often shows up quietly in the decision to step back, to protect one's values, and to speak only when the time feels right. Her story also resonates beyond Hollywood. It speaks to anyone who has endured discomfort in silence, believing that speaking up would cost too much. Meg's reflection affirms that while silence may protect in the moment, truth has its own kind of power, especially when shared with intention rather than urgency. In the end, Meg Ryan's revelation isn't about who she struggled with. It's about who she became because of it. At 64, she stands not as someone seeking closure, but as someone offering it to herself and to others who see their own experiences reflected in hers.